Srimad Bhagavad Gita. We are coming to the end of chapter 2, picking up from verse 56. So remember how we're at this particular juncture in chapter 2, where Arjuna asks Krishna, can you describe to me what are the symptoms? And he uses this phrase, stita pragya, I believe is the phrase that he used. Yes, stita pragya, which refers to someone whose wisdom is established, who's living in firm wisdom. And he asks Krishna, what are the symptoms of such a soul? How do they act in this world? How do they not act in this world? What are their characteristics? How do they speak? How do they act? And how do they inact, so to speak? These are the three questions. And then Krishna proceeds to answer. So we are in verse 56. One, Krishna is describing these characteristics. One who is undisturbed by sorrow, whose hankering for pleasure has gone, and who is free from attachment, fear, and anger, is known as a silent sage of steady mind. One who is undisturbed by sorrow, whose hankering for pleasure has gone, and who is free from attachment, fear, and anger, is known as a silent sage of steady minds. So just this one verse is such a beautiful meditation. And whenever I open the pages of Bhagavad Gita, I feel like I've taken a bath, I'm taking a mental bath. Because when we hear these advices and these descriptions of the nature of enlightened souls, and it gives us, it kind of acts like a mirror, then we can contemplate, how much are we, how close are we to such an ideal? We contemplate, how much we may be disturbed by sorrow, how much hankering for pleasure we have, and how full of attachment, fear, and anger that we may have. So we may reflect on these things within ourselves, these elements, these undesirable elements within ourselves, and get this reminder, get this wake-up call, like, this isn't cool and this isn't necessary. All of these things are actually choices. We choose to be attached. We choose to suffer. We choose to, have fear, anger, attachment. We have a choice, because of our previous lives, because of our previous tendencies and activities. We have like these karmic tendencies, samskaras, right? That is the word that is sometimes used. These like impressions that are embedded in our operating system at present. We formed these on the basis of our previous behavior, but we don't have to keep, we can reformat. We reformat the drive. If we see that things are going a bit crooked, operating system isn't really supporting our true needs, we can do a reformat. We don't have to, we're not stuck there. Sometimes, I think we all, in using computers, right? Sometimes you get to that point using your computer where you realize you need to, thank you, Didi, where you realize you need to like reformat, but you can be lazy because like, oh, I've got to back up all these files, and I'm going to have to do a lot of preparation. It's going to take a bit of effort for me to reformat, or like also like in switching over to another computer, there can be this laziness because you're just so used to the old dysfunction, right? You're used to the dysfunction and you're too lazy to put in the little bit of effort required to have a more functional running computer, right? So it's like that, we get stuck in our syndromes, we get stuck in our tendencies, and we're lazy to put in the little effort that will enable us to, in the long run, live a much more fulfilling, meaningful, happy existence, right? So when we're reading these verses in Bhagavad Gita, it's kind of like this wake-up call, like, hey, this isn't cool, and this isn't necessary, and this isn't helpful. Sometimes we observe, or we we come across, or we may experience ourselves, that, persons do something which is really reprehensible, and they're fine about it until they get exposed, right? And then they're full of shame and embarrassment, humiliation. And I think to myself sometimes, like what you're, like, objectively speaking, what you were doing, let's say it's some crime someone was committing, what you were doing was so, degraded. And obviously afterwards, it's not like these persons are all psychopaths. In some cases they are. But mostly, I think such persons, once they become exposed, they have some remorse, whether it's, in some level of exploitation. There's so many varieties of that. We don't need to go into the details, but there's so many varieties of exploitation, right? And generally what we see is persons that they're fine about it until the world finds out, right? Then they feel some remorse, then they feel shame. And I think to myself, well, why didn't you feel that when you were doing it? Like, why were you comfortable doing it when you were doing it? And it's only when people found out that you started to feel ashamed, right? Because when that happens, it's like this mirror is put in front of you, and you're forced to confront the fact that this is not okay, this is not healthy, this is not normal, this is not acceptable, right? So in the same way, when we dive into these scriptures, or when we hear from a higher spiritual source, it's kind of like we're putting that mirror in front of ourselves. We can't just hide away in our dark corner, but we're putting that mirror in front of ourselves, and we're kind of forced to face up to this, like, oh, this tendency, this habit, this mental pattern, this activity, this is not healthy, this is not helpful, this is not functional, this is unhealthy, this is dysfunctional, this is not spiritual, right? Or this is exploitative, right? Whatever it may be, when we open these holy pages of this holy book, we're being exposed to this higher way of life, higher way of being, then it's like that mirror is being put in front of us, and we have to kind of like ask ourselves, how much do I square up, against this ideal? And how much do I need to clean up? How much do I need to reformat? So it's very purifying, in one word. It's extremely purifying to hear these words. It's like a stream, of cleansing water that's washing upon us and purifying us, cleansing us, awakening us. Okay, so I'll move on to verse 57. One who is not attached to anything in this world, who neither enjoys nor resents auspiciousness or inauspiciousness, his wisdom is firmly established. One who is not attached to anything in this world, who neither enjoys nor resents auspiciousness or inauspiciousness, his wisdom is firmly established. So this is one of the principal themes of Bhagavad Gita, achieving this state of equanimity, equilibrium. We live in a world of duality. We cannot get away from that. So what are we going to do? Are we going to, when the waves are high, are we going to go high, and the waves are low, then we go low? When the news is good, then we're good. When the news is bad, we're bad. When we have friends, we're going to be depressed. When we don't have, when we have, when we have friends, we're going to be happy. When we don't, well, sometimes that can also make us depressed. Right? Sometimes our friends can be our worst enemies. But when we have friends, we're going to be happy. When we don't have friends, we're going to be depressed. Like, is that how we're going to live? Just living at the base surface level of reality, depending solely on what the external stimuli of the mental, physical, sensory planes. No, that is an ignorant way to live. We need to connect with a deeper plane, a more stable spiritual plane. So this is one of the principal themes of Bhagavad Gita, and this is one of the definitions of yoga also, which is the main subject matter of Bhagavad Gita as a whole. And now this next verse we're coming to, sorry, well, coming up, one of these verses coming up, it's one of the most famous verses of Bhagavad Gita in this regard. So I'll continue. Verse 58, when one's senses are controlled and totally withdrawn from their objects, like the limbs of the tortoise withdrawn in its shell, his wisdom is firmly established. When one's senses are controlled and totally withdrawn from their objects, like the limbs of the tortoise withdrawn in its shell, his wisdom is firmly established. I really like that analogy. No, it's a very helpful analogy. We may come across sometimes, right? A tortoise that, it's like hiding in its shell, and you only see the outer shell, but the limbs are within, right? So in the same way, when we are on the path of enlightenment, the path of realization, self-realization, God realization, then we become more and more aware of these lower tendencies within ourselves. And we may not be able to become free of them, or we will not be able to become free of them right away, but we will have more control over them. So there may be the urge or desire to do various things which are not helpful to us or anyone, but we're able to keep that within. We're not going to express that. We're not going to act upon that. And of course, in a higher stage, then those will not be there at all. There will be no question of self-control, because those desires, urges are not even there in the first place. And ultimately, these are coverings. These are superficial coverings. The soul has no need, no desire, no association with these things. But before we reach that stage, there needs to be some degree of discipline, of control. Otherwise the world will be in chaos, right? If everyone is just, expressing their whims as they so please, whatever they may be, and persons who do live in that way cause chaos and destruction, disturbance, degradation within this world. So I was speaking about that actually with Janardhan Maharaj just before I left, in regards to one particular unhappy incident which took place, an incidents of exploitation that took place within our community, actually. And he made a very good point. He was saying, actually, all of us, we all have our lower nature, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. We are human, right? We're under the influence of the material energy, and we can't blame anyone for having lower desires, to hold that within them. And especially in this age of Kali, this age of Kali Yuga, the age of quarrel. In this age, the senses are particularly weak and degraded, to the extent that there's this special dispensation given to the persons living in this age, that they will not be held accountable for sinful thoughts. Now, we were discussing this in one of our meetings recently, I believe. Whereas in previous ages, you would be held accountable even for your thoughts. You would have to pay the price for a sinful thought. But in this age, because we are so degraded, our senses are so out of control, then this special dispensation is given that we don't have to face the consequences of our thoughts. Thank goodness for that. So it's understandable if we have, this is what I was discussing with Janardhan, he was expressing, it's understandable, if we all have some lower nature, lower thoughts, but we don't act upon those things. And that's what makes the difference between, someone who's living as an upright, healthy member, citizen of the world, and someone who's creating disturbance and degradation. We may all have the seeds of that within ourselves, but the question is whether we can control those things. We will not go to impose that on others. We will not go to impose that in the environment. We are not the center of existence, or we have the right to impose our own whims and random desires upon others in the environment. No, so we will keep those things within. We must live in a regulated way to some degree or another. Oh, if it's fine if Sheena needs to come in, no problem. You can come in, no problem. Okay, so continue with verse. Oh yeah, so 59, this is the verse which I was mentioning is very well known. Some of you may be familiar with this verse. And I'll read the Sanskrit of this one because it is an important word. Vishaya vinivartante niraharasya dehina rasavarjam rasopyasya param jushtva nivartate. The embodied being may renounce the sense objects, but the taste for them remains. But that too vanishes for the man of wisdom by his vision of the Supreme. The embodied being may renounce the sense objects, but the taste for them remains. But that too vanishes for the man of wisdom by his vision of the Supreme. So now Bhagavad Gita is kind of going into a related discussion here. This point about higher taste, this was how Srila Swami Maharaj Prabhupada referred to this verse, so this being the essential point here. So then the question may come, okay, so we understand the need for controlling our lower desires and urges, but how can that actually be sustainable? How is that actually going to be sustainable? Because we all know that just living in a state of repression, that only gets us so far, right? We were discussing this in one of our meetings a few weeks ago. There will come, if we're living in this kind of artificial state of self-repression, then there will come that moment when we just explode. There will come that moment where we won't be able to maintain it anymore. It will become too difficult. It's too dry. It's not sustainable, can't last. So then this is the answer. And this is also one of the points about bhakti, one of the trump cards, we can say. This is one of bhakti's trump cards, that there has to be a relationship with a higher entity, with a higher plane. Don't just tell someone to give up smoking, but tell them, do this instead. This is much more enjoyable. Do this instead. Take up a hobby that will engage you. Don't just tell someone, stop eating meat. You're going to go to hell for eating meat, or whatever. Maybe you're destroying the planet eating meat, but become a happy vegetarian. And here's how. Here are all the wonderful things you can eat when you're vegetarian. So there's this wonderful emphasis on the positive side and the cultivation of bhakti. And that's the only healthy and wholesome way for the soul to live. That's the only sustainable way by which a soul can move away from the lower plane, from the lower energy and our lower nature. Where actually it's not about that. Our spiritual life is not about what we're not doing, but it's about what we are doing. So as I was saying, this is one of the trump cards of the path of bhakti yoga, the path of devotion, because in many other lines of practice and many other ideologies, there is more emphasis on that side. And in one way, there is more simplicity in that. It's just, this is such a complex world of desire that ultimately leads to misery. Let's just whitewash that out. Let's just enter this plane of peace and oneness. There's a simplicity in that. There's an attraction to that. But ultimately, it's not sustainable. It's not enough. It's not enough. It can be meaningful up to a point, but only to that point. It's like I often give the example, like if someone's been in prison, if someone's in prison, then their whole focus may be on getting out of prison. Or I was reflecting yesterday, and I was coming through the airport, how many people in this world, they struggle just for the basic necessities of life, like food and these things that we all take for granted. We all live somewhat privileged lives, to one degree or another, but there are millions of people in the world who struggle just for basic human needs like food and clean water and shelter. Millions, if not billions of people in the world who live like that every day. And so if you're living in this state of like overwhelming lack, or overwhelming struggle, then that's all you can think about, right? All you can think about is getting that. All you can think about is getting water, getting food, getting out of prison, right? That's all you can think about. And these are just like basic human needs, right? But then what happens when you get those things? Then what do you think about? And then what do you do, right? Like the struggle's over now. So now what do you do? Now you're out of you've been released into the free world. You're out of prison. And now what do you do? Is that like the end of the story? Is that your victory? I got released from prison. Like, okay, great, good for you. Is that like your life accomplishment that you got freed from prison? It may be, but that's a little sad if so. Now you're, but no, like now you're in the free world. What are you actually going to do to make a positive contribution? What are you going to do as a meaningful contribution to society? That's how our lives will become meaningful. Now, what are we doing on the positive side? What contribution are we making? Not, what did we get away from? What are we not doing? Okay, I'm not murdering people anymore. I'm not killing people anymore. I'm not robbing. I'm not raping anymore. Like, okay, good for you. Now you're a decent human being. Like, whoop-de-doo. Go write a book about it. But no, what are you actually going to do that's really meaningful from a higher standard? Like, okay, at a lower standard, we can appreciate that. Let me shake your hand. I'm so happy you're making some progress. We can appreciate that to a point, right? But then from that point, you're also expected to move further along. So in the same way, in the spiritual sense, at a lower stage of realization, we may be struggling just to get away from the negative side, just to get away from the struggling and the suffer of desire and entanglement and karma. There may be some emphasis on that, right? But then once we've become freed from that, then what? Are we really going to be satisfied just eternally living in this state of freedom from negativity? No, by nature, we need to be engaged with something. We need to be active. By nature, we are desirous. By nature, we have emotion, we love, we feel. These are things are inherent to the soul. So we can't get away from that. But how is it being expressed? Once we've gotten away from that lower nature, then we want to express that in a spiritual way, in the spiritual sphere. And furthermore, unless we can do that, we're just going to fall back down again. Unless we can get some attachment for the higher taste, and this is what's being discussed in this verse, 59 of Bhagavad Gita, unless we can get hooked on that higher taste, we're going to fall back down again. You know, it's like someone may be able to get free of a drinking habit or smoking habit or whatever it may be. But unless they're really absorbed and engaged in something higher and more meaningful, they're going to slip down again eventually. That proclivity is still within them, and they're going to slip back to it eventually. So they need to become established, fixed in a higher sphere of engagement, something that's also enough to grab them, absorb them. So this is what is being expressed here, that someone may artificially reject the things of this world and their desires and urges, but that tendency will still be within them. But the person who's acquired some taste, some attraction for the higher plane, that nature, that desire will completely vanish for them. They're absorbed in something else. They're busy with something else. And that's satisfying and engaging them. Does anyone want to share any thoughts at this point? Any comments or questions, or should we just carry on? Suvasini, did you anything you want to share with our group? Okay. Carry on then. And I see also Narayani has joined us. Welcome. And our dear sister in California, Lynn, our new friend, has joined us. Braja Bala, I believe maybe our sister in Ukraine. Welcome. Haven't had you with us for a while. Nice to have you with us. And also Lua in Brazil has also joined us. So welcome to all of you.
I want to share really quickly.
Yeah, please.
It's so I feel like if a devotee is struggling with something, like let's say they're in prison or like they're going through some difficulty with substance abuse or whatever, but once they come out of that, when they're still doing their devotional service, I think it's important for us individually on our path of Krishna consciousness to take that as a milestone. Just say, okay, I've come to this far, and I'm gonna continue moving forward from here. It's like a baseline, I think it's important for us to acknowledge those little victories that we do make, so that we continue to have the enthusiasm and determination to continue on. And I remember that analogy. I forget where I heard it, but like when it's like unplugging a fan, the blades keep spinning. So you still have the desire to do something, but we just don't indulge in that. We instead keep focusing our actions and attention on devotional activities. So that's my reflection. Yes.
Very nice. Thanks for sharing that, Narottam. Oh, you're absolutely right. We are in kindergarten, right? And we need those little pats on the head for those little milestones, as you say. That we're learning the ABCs, we're learning to tie our shoelaces, all these things, and in the big picture, of course, they doesn't count for very much, but relative to where we are, that's a huge thing. That's a major thing. So you're absolutely right. We don't want to denigrate that, and also in our path of progress, we can fall down at any time, and we are still, even it's mentioned, Srila Sridhar Maharaj has pointed out, even someone who's reached the stage of Mahabhagavat, even they are not in a safe position. There's still a risk that they could come back down. So, we are in a vulnerable position, and that will continue. We may even reach a relatively high stage on the path, but that risk is still there. And the point I'm making is we shouldn't be discouraged by that. If practitioners, sincere practitioners, do struggle with these things. No, it's not anything to be overly discouraged by. We will have to face up to these things. That is normal. And we should remain optimistic and hopeful and continue with full confidence on the path. So yes, thank you for sharing that. Cool. Any other shares from anyone, or should we continue the reading? And Jayadev has just joined us also. Welcome.
I think it's
Okay.
pretty powerful that what you said, Vishaka Didi, is that, and then what? I think so much, you talked about being privileged, like we don't have to necessarily struggle that much to just have our basic needs covered, et cetera, et cetera. But what's really echoing is like, and then what? It looks to me that our, my surrounding is like, everybody is just stuck in that stage of setting things up. It's like house is there, fridge is full, and then what? And then, sitting on the sofa kind of,
Right.
and then still celebrating like that we're not in line for the food stamps, or celebrating that we're not having some kind of abuse, like you said, like you're still celebrating that you just got out of prison. I feel like we are at a stage that we are coming out of prison, and then what? I think this is a really great line to add to sadhana, is and then what? It's like, oh, I've done my rounds. I'm like, I'm gonna just go pick my nose now. Like we still have a lot to do, and I think I'm very inspired to kind of practice. And then what? So
That's a good line. That's a good line.
Good.
I like it. I like it.
Because I kick back too. I kick back, and I'm just kind of, done this, and I'm done this, and I added something, and then I'm still in the like, oh, that was really good, or I'm stuck in the, oh, I didn't do that, and that's not so good, but it's like on either side, I have to ask myself, and then what? And then what? Just move into it, coming out of that ignorance,
Very nice. Beautiful. That's awesome. That's a t-shirt. Yeah, this is one of the reasons why it's so crucial that we keep hearing, and particularly hearing from the saints, because we get that kind of like readjustment, we get that refocusing that we need. Like we're kind of at some level of some type of equilibrium in terms of our spiritual practice. We may be feeling that, and we're just kind of like, normalizing and, too comfortable with our lower human nature, right? And we may get sucked into lower patterns, tendencies. But then we get some injection, we hear the words of our gurus, and it's like, oh, okay, I need to recalibrate. I need to reassess everything now. Like, whoa, like what are the things that they're reflecting on, in their day-to-day, moment-by-moment existence? Like, what are the things that they're considering to be important? I had on Friday, we in one of our meetings, we went through a video of Srila Sridhar Maharaj where he was giving an explanation of the famous Gayatri Mantra, it's a famous explanation of Srila Sridhar Maharaj. I think most of our friends in this group are familiar with that. It's a very profound explanation of the famous ancient Vedic Gayatri Mantra, this Om Bhur Bhurva Swaha, this mantra. And it's such a profound explanation. And hearing that, was like, I felt like I was being recalibrated, like everything's being like moved around in my headspace. Like, oh, this is what's important. Oh yeah, I forgot. And this is Srila Sridhar Maharaj. It's not like he's sitting at a podium giving a big lecture. This is just him, like, relaxing in the afternoon and sharing what he happens to be thinking about at that particular moment. This is what, so he's always reflecting on subjects of this nature. This is what's important. So it's like you get this whole, it's like we live, is that a video? Yeah, and I can share the link. You can find it easily on YouTube if you search Sridhar Maharaj Gayatri Mantra. You can find it, but I can get the link as well. Someone shared it in a meeting. It's also, yeah, it's also published in Subjective Evolution, the last chapter. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very wonderful explanation, because that Gayatri Mantra, like it's a very famous, I mean, even like I remember when I was in Thailand, I'd hear it. Like, you know, people have all these like kind of jazzy musical renditions. Like I heard it like on somebody's like ringtone. Like there are all these like kind of like jazzy renditions of the Gayatri Mantra that you'll hear. Like it's so well known. It's like so widely discussed and chanted, and in many yoga groups in the West, like they'll just, you know, normally this mantra is something that will be given to men at the time of Brahminical initiation, like after initiation. But in many yoga groups in the West, they just kind of like hand it out like candy, and they'll have a group exercise chanting it. So it's very widely chanted, known, discussed, but nobody really knows what it means, you know, or there are different theories on it. And the general conception of it is that it's a prayer to the sun, Savitor, right, the sun. But Srila Sridhar Maharaj gives this very profound explanation that, you know, really the sun is referring to Atma, the soul, the self, because what is it that actually enables us to see? On an external level, we can say the sun, but on a deeper level, it is the Atma, it is the soul, it is consciousness within us, which enables us to see anything. So Srila Sridhar Maharaj explains this Gayatri Mantra, it's actually giving this wonderful, presenting this systematic gradation, you know, from soul to super soul. And ultimately, the Gayatri Mantra is a glorification of Radharani, the divine feminine principle, and expressing the ideal of divine service to her. You know, so it's such a profound explanation. And so this is where Srila Sridhar Maharaj is living. These are like on his list of values, important things that he's thinking about today. This is on his list, you know, whereas mine might be, what am I going to have for breakfast? Or I need, you know, silly things like this. You know, these are on my list of priorities. You know, where is he living? He's like living deep, deep in this world of consciousness, divine consciousness. So it's like, you know, like we live in these very like zoomed in realities, like zoomed in self-centered realities, whereas it's like if you're looking at your, like if we're finding our location on Google Maps, right, we could be like zoomed in our tiny little place within the whole. When you start to zoom out and you see like where you are, and like, oh, I represent a tiny little speck within this, you know, massive place called planet Earth. And this is just planet Earth. How many millions, billions of other planets are there just within the material sphere? So anyway, you know, listening to our gurus, listening to our divine teachers, it's like we're kind of zooming out and we're getting this broader perspective of reality as it truly is. You know, reality, you know, where everything is properly adjusted. We're not just zoomed in on one part, but we're seeing things within the whole. We still give importance to the part, but we also need to understand the relationship of the part within the whole and to the whole, right? Understanding our proper place within things. So it's so helpful when we tune in to the higher vibration, then we automatically get this sweet adjustment. And it's always sweet, you know, it's not like we're being hit on the head. You know, it's not like it makes us depressed or we feel so worthless and small. It's such a joyful thing. It's like, wow, such wonderful, much more interesting it's so much more interesting than my tiny little finite world. And all the tiny little finite things, that are going on in my world. Like there's this big, beautiful world out there, and I have a part within that too. It's a joyful realization. There are so many bigger, more beautiful, wonderful, and interesting things to think about and talk about other than my tiny little finite existence. So, like we are like one drop in an ocean of nectar. Srila Gurudev phrases, and Srila Sridhar Maharaj also, they have phrases like that. Like we are like tiny drops within an ocean of nectar. This is our good fortune. So we just have to realize we're in that ocean of nectar. That is there for us. Welcome, Ramananda Prabhu is also just.
Dandavas Vishaka Didi.
Dandavat Prabhu. Happy to see you. But we have 10 more minutes left. Anyone else want to raise any point, or should we read a few more verses before we close for today? Gangalila is nodding her head. Okay, I'm going to read a few more verses. So verse 60. Oh, and this is also, we discussed this point with Narottam Prabhu. And yet, O son of Kunti, the turbulent senses can forcibly plunder the mind of even the wise person striving for liberation. So, despite our best intentions, right? Despite all our noble endeavors, despite all our best efforts, we may still, become prey to our mind and senses. We may become a victim of these weaknesses, our own weaknesses. So that is normal. That is okay. It happens. These urges are very strong. And as we mentioned, especially in this age of Kali, but we should not be disheartened. We should not give up.
Vishaka, do you know Edward?
Yeah.
Do you know Edward? I just admitted him into the room, but I don't know him.
I have been giving the link out.
Oh, okay.
So we may get some unknown names. I have been sharing the link. Yeah, well, we'll give him a chance and let him in. Generally speaking, I think just having a waiting room enabled should protect us, because the hackers, they by default target people who don't have a waiting room enabled. So we've already got an extra layer of security. So I think we'll just, unless, it doesn't work out, I think it's safe to just let whoever comes in the waiting room. We'll see if we have to pay for that. Devoted to me, the bhakti yogi brings his senses under proper control. Firmly established is the wisdom of one whose senses are controlled. So we may suffer, under the influence of our lower nature, lower urges. We may come under the influence of them from time to time, but we will keep our focus on that higher reality. We will keep our focus on that higher cultivation, that higher connection, and we will eventually be able to overcome these things by dint of that higher connection. But one whose thoughts, and now these verses, 62, these following two verses, they describe this sequence, which I think all of us can identify with to some extent or another, which most of us have experienced. It's a mirror, as I was saying, it's a helpful mirror. So one whose thoughts dwell on the objects of the senses becomes attached to them. From attachment, desire is born, and from desire, anger arises. Anger gives rise to delusion, And the power of delusion causes forgetfulness. Forgetfulness destroys the intelligence. And when the intelligence is lost, one loses all. So first, there's this first thing described here in the sequence, thinking too much on the objects of the senses, or becoming or being exposed to particular temptations or pulls on the senses, being in that association. And there's this helpful phrase here, as I recall, or maybe it's later in Bhagavad, no, it is here, Sangat Sanjayate Kama. That desire is born from association. So this is also helpful to consider in choosing our association, that we will become our association, or we will naturally begin to develop desires along the lines of those with whom we associate. What they desire, what they like, we will naturally start to develop those things ourselves. So we must choose our association, choose our environment carefully. Then by contemplating these things, then desire arises. First attachment develops, then from attachment comes desire, and then from desire comes anger. Why? Because once you have that attachment to something, if it is taken away from you, then you become angry, right? You want something, you have this attachment for something, then if it's removed from you, if that connection, association is broken, then you become angry as a natural consequence. Anger gives rise to delusion, and the power of delusion causes forgetfulness. Forgetfulness destroys the intelligence, and when the intelligence is lost, one loses all. So it's a very helpful sequence to meditate upon and to observe within our own inner workings, the workings of our own mind. We can recognize this kind of sequence that we go through, and we can try to, as the English expression goes, nip it in the bud. Once we see something starting, we can try to check it, try to get it under control. Okay, well, I think we can close there for today. I think that's a lot for us to meditate on this coming week. Does anyone want to add any final thoughts, or shall we ask Angalila to pray us out of today's meeting? Okay, Gangalila, do you want to pray us out?
Yeah, I'm confused because of somebody entered and I don't know who that is, and I don't know if that's a prank or something. Did you just see that?